Valentine, on the other hand, is miserable. So we've got Caroline Duffy, who was a lesbian, sort of possibly, I've forgotten the word, not complaining, reflecting the cynicism of her time and sort of highlighting the effects and the damage maybe that society does with its expectations on what a romantic couple should be, whether it's that it should be a heterosexual couple or whether it should be that a good couple gives each other roses. So you've got this idea that, you know, a protest was the word I was looking for. Okay, I'm not going to go into Valentine too much because I think it's pretty straightforward. Again, she directly addresses a lover, so that is a typical traditional love poem feature, but I think that's probably as far as it goes. One of the key images in the poem is the platinum loop shrinking to a wedding ring, and you've got this idea of, firstly, the wedding ring is cyclical as well, so you've got very similar to the ending of Keats' Autumn and London, the end, which highlights the cyclical nature of a society. You've got this cyclical idea of a wedding ring making everything go round in circles. But it's very much presented negatively because you've got the platinum loops. Platinum's obviously expensive, but they shrink to a wedding ring. So you've got this idea that obviously shrink is a very negative word. It's diminishing. So you're diminishing the platinum to make it into a wedding ring. So if we take that as a symbol for the person, you're diminishing the person to make them into a married person. The scent will cling to your fingers. Again, she's focusing on smell, which is our most powerful sense that sort of just can't escape it. You know, you can't block out smells as well as you can close your eyes and block out sights. So that's a really effective image as well, as is the word cling, the dynamic verb cling, really grasping onto the knife there. So even if you try and kill it, love, or if you try to change it, you actually can't escape it. So she really creates this idea that you're trapped. It's very, very feminist, very, very much challenges like traditional points of view about romance and how red roses and hearts aren't important with this central extended metaphor of the onion. Moons change all the time, so it's quite interesting. She calls it a moon wrapped in paper, and obviously the more you go into the love, the closer you get to the centre of the onion, the more that you're possibly going to get hurt, hence the blinding you with tears. It's just this idea that the more you go in, the more stuck you are, and it will overpower you. So she perhaps suggests that we're better to keep to an eros kind of love if we want to avoid all this encompassing violence later on, that sometimes it's better to just stay on the surface. We've also got, it's quite interesting that she talks about a reflection, because that highlights that, you know, love, how you see your love will directly influence what you see in the mirror. So this is again very similar to Sonnet 43, where she actually openly says that her identity has been shaped by this man. Caroline Duffy does the opposite. She says the same thing, that love will shape how you see yourself, but she very much protests against that. And, you know, she highlights that you have no stability in who you are as a person because you're a wobbling photograph. So there's a lack of stability there. Okay, now going to move on to London. Not going to lie, I'm getting a bit bored of hearing my own voice. So London is another good favourite of mine. William Blake was kind of on the borderline of empiricism and romanticism. He is technically an early romantic poet, but the language he uses here is not reflective of romanticism. He kind of marks the transition between empiricism, where society was focused on science and reason, and we had Isaac Newton's findings, and everyone was very much focused on logically making their way through the world, towards the birth of romanticism, where everything was all about feelings and abstract ideas, and we kind of we rebelled against that idea of science and reason. So the other thing to highlight as well is that Blake is protesting against his society in London, obviously, and he's protesting against the Industrial Revolution, which was in its relatively early stages at this point compared to Dickens when he was writing A Christmas Carol, nearly 100 years later, 50 to 100 years later. So already, I mean, you can imagine how bad it was by the time we got to Dickens if this was already the case in sort of 1794. So the key thing for your higher marks here is you're focusing on the words like marks and how he transfers verbs into nouns and nouns into verbs. So we've got marks of weakness and marks of woe in line 4, where a mark of weakness and a mark of woe, they're nouns there, and they're literally, it makes the weakness concrete. Their weakness is not something that they feel or that they can be described as. Their weakness is on their faces. It is literally visible for everyone to see, which obviously gives it far more power. So by making the weakness into a noun, he makes it so much more powerful, and it governs their whole minds, their bodies, the whole of society. And the same with the woe as well. So he highlights the misery of the people, but he also highlights the powerlessness of the people. Just in the line before that, he uses mark as a verb. I mark in every face, so to see in every face. So he himself is presented as being very separate to what the people are like. He's an outsider looking in, which perhaps gives him a unique perspective, because as you know, even now, when you're within the society and you follow its rules, you don't always notice the bad things about it because you just think that that's normal. But as an outsider, he can see that, and that's really emphasized by the I. And he's wondering, he's out of it, he's kind of, you know, above it, he can wander around, he's not part of this system. So I wonder contrasts in the first line with chartered, which is regimented and government owned, and you flow that way just like the river does. We've then got the repetition of cry, and again we've got nouns there for cry and voice. You know, again, a cry is usually a verb, but here it's a noun. I know it can be a noun, but he uses it very precisely as a noun, again, to make it more powerful, more permanent, more of a concrete thing in the world. And then the last line of stanza 2 is really important, because we've got the mind-fudged monocles, which is obviously that they are trapped themselves. And this is kind of, to me, the most pessimistic line in this poem, and this idea that he doesn't think society is going to change, because if the people themselves are trapped in their mind, how will they even know that they need to protest and get out? So this poem is essential because it really highlights people at the time, especially given the fact that it's written in very accessible language for the time. It really, hopefully, would have resonated with people and helped them to feel like they need to change their own lives. We've then got references to the establishments, so the church and the soldier and the palace, and how they affect society and blacken it literally. And then the last stanza, we've got this idea that society will constantly be in these horrible cycles because the prostitute is affecting the children, who is infecting their children, etc. And then you've got that final oxymoron of the marriage hurts, where love and death come together. And can even a healthy marriage exist in a world where at this time marriage and mistresses were quite acceptable and normal? You didn't get married for love, you got married for practical reasons, as we said before. So this again is another aspect, another avenue of that social construct, that's what marriage was, because people were cheating left, right and centre, and they're plagues on society, where perhaps maybe the relationships between people represent a symbolic to a bigger range of diseases that are spread between the way people treat each other. Really emphasised by the cacophony of the be there, the blasts and the blights, really sort of negative way to end. We've also got lots of the, which is definite articles, kind of limits anyone's individuality, and also in the every as well. Every man, every man, the chimney sweeper's cry, not a chimney sweeper or my favourite chimney sweeper or the 10 boys who were chimney sweepers, just the chimney, all of them. There's no individuality there. Everyone's experienced the same misery, and that's very much reflected in the structure and the rhythm and the rhyme scheme. I think this is one of the best poems for analysing structure, because it really is so regimented. It really effectively represents the society and how constraining it is, and how you can't move and break free. Going back to that key image of the mind-forged manacles, which does also reflect Rousseau's idea, philosopher Rousseau, which you can talk about, that I think maybe 20 years earlier he wrote that man is born free, but everywhere society keeps him in chains. So it was quite a popular notion at the time, and Rousseau lived in France, which was kind of well ahead of Britain in terms of its romanticism and revolting against, revolt is okay, or rebelling against the establishment. So you can definitely trace Rousseau's ideas in this poem, that men are born free, but it's society that messes us up. Okay, moving on to living space. We've talked about, obviously, it being about the slums of Mumbai. We've talked about Dhaka being, because she grew up in two different cultures, that she was then well placed to talk with an outside but inside perspective. And that's where this optimism comes from, because from an outsider, from a Westerner's point of view, where we live in sort of very regimented, ordered streets and homes, where everything's built properly, I think maybe we might look and see negativity, but Dhaka's very well placed to look and see the beauty in that. Like when I was in Malaysia, there's just, everything's just haphazard, but there is a beauty to it, but it takes a while to get used to because you're used for everything being in straight lines. And as you know, there are just not enough straight lines there. The key thing about this poem is the optimism at the end of the bright thin walls of faith, and it's very much focused on attitude. That if you have the right attitude and if you believe in the power of those eggs, if you believe that they can stay up, then they will. And I think Darker really celebrates that. There's some really nice language, word level analysis you can get out of here, like the use of the dynamic verbs like balancing and thrusting and clutching, or also the sort of very key abstract nouns like miraculous and faith. They are so key, and they're both very well placed and structured in the poem as well. I feel like everything else is really obvious. It's not a particularly difficult one, really. I think it's key, this idea of the dark edge of the universe. So there's like two sides, and that they live on the edge of a universe. But maybe you might want to think about, well, which side is it better to be on? The endless vast universe, where maybe you might fall into being like a small fish in a big pond, and you don't really feel like you have a sense of identity because it's just vast and empty. Whereas where they live, there's so much happening, and it's loads of chaos, and they feel like they can have a bit of an identity about them. So maybe you might want to explore that. They live on the dark edge of a slanted universe, but they're gathering the light. They're living where the life is. So that's something to explore. Okay, grief. Right. Basically, you've got a poem here where, as imperceptibly as grief, imperceptibly is this gradual change. So she's talking about how she uses the seasons. So the seasons represent how just as the seasons can merge into one another, grief as well, the processes of grief also merge into one another as you kind of get through it. Okay? Now, personally, I don't feel like grief is imperceptible. I feel like the stages of grief are quite clear, but maybe not to the person who's experiencing them. So that's sort of a possible place you can evaluate the writer's meaning. So throughout, she symbolises the movement of grief through the movement of grief through the seasons. So the summer goes away, and it's imperceptible, just like this grief is. And you've got these ideas of this. So the quietness is distilled. Now, distilled is a word usually used for a liquid. So it's not something that you'd usually find for quietness. To distill something is to purify it. Now, quietness is usually pure anyway, like a pure quiet. So you've got this idea that the quietness is really carefully placed. It's been really perfectly sorted, and it's also very permanent. And because of that, you've got this idea of what grief is. Grief is the absence of something forever. So, and it is quite pure because it'll never be, infected by anything, because the person will never come back. So that grief will remain as it is at that time. You've also got which is an indefinite article. So it's weird because you've got this importance of the capital Q, but then the sort of lack of importance by making it instead of the, which possibly links to the contradictions of grief and the contradictions that you want to get past your grief, because obviously then that means you can live again, but you also don't want to, because that means that you're letting the person go, and it can be quite hard. Oh my god, there's a wasp. Oh, it's dead. Anyway, we've then got the personification of nature, spending time with herself. So she's feminine, just like she was into Autumn, and this is very typical romantic. Remember that Dickinson was late romantic, but she was quite a sort of isolated person. She was kind of very reflecting on her society. There's not a sense of her being involved in society. And I think this is very much embedded into the poem with this sequestered afternoon. So nature's trying to hide away, as it would when death's just happened. It's not its best part of life or nature. Death is not the best part of nature. So the dusk is coming in earlier because she's grieving. And summer's coming along, so the morning is foreign when it's shining now, because it shouldn't be there anymore. Summer's ending because she's no longer happy, she's grieving, and then we're going to gradually be replaced by autumn.